All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Left Bank Books is presenting Laura Meckler, national education writer for the Washington Post. And she is discussing Dreamtown, Shaker Heights, and the quest for racial equality, an in-depth analysis of desegregation efforts in our hometown of Shaker Heights, Ohio. Susan Orlean calls it the story of one Ohio town, but also the much bigger story of America, eminently, readable, and genuinely inspiring. And in conversation tonight is Aisha Sultan. And tonight's event is going to be possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, and it keeps our bookstore open, keeps your street paved, your libraries funded, your parks free, and so many of the other things that make St. Louis such a wonderful place to live. And I want to thank you all again for shopping local and supporting this event. And we also want to welcome our virtual audience tonight. Hello, webcam. My name is Elena Jove, and I'm a bookseller here at Left Bank Books. And I will tell you a little bit more about another event we have coming up. We are so happy to be producing many great events this fall. We will be hosting Adia Harvey Wingfield and her new book, The Gray Areas, How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. And she will be here in store on October 23rd. And you can go to our website, left-bank.com, to see a full list of all of our programming, which expands for readers of all ages. And I'm going to give a quick about the author and conversation partner. Laura Meckler is a national education writer for the Washington Post, where she covers education across the country, as well as national education policy and politics. She previously reported on the White House presidential politics, immigration, and healthcare for the Wall Street Journal, as well as health and social policy for the Associated Press. Her honors include Nieman Fellowship and Livingston Award for National Reporting, and she was part of a team that won the George Polk Award for Justice Reporting. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and 2 sons. Aisha Sultan is a nationally syndicated columnist, award-winning filmmaker, and featured writer. Her work has run in more than 100 publications, including The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and Newsweek. She has won several national honors recognizing her writing. Her work explores social change with an emphasis on education, families, and inequality. So I'll turn it over to these two. It's a wonderful conversation.
I'm very excited to be here with my friend Laura. I've been a fan of her work, and you should follow her work at the Washington Post if you don't already. And also because I was an education reporter for 10 years before I started writing a column and before I started writing feature stories. So deeply interested in this topic, and you wrote about it in such an accessible, I felt like, I got emotional reading this book several times, emotionally connected kind of way, which is how I love policy to be written about, in a way that touches you. So place us in Shaker Heights right now, and when you were there, just if people aren't familiar, where it is, what it looks like.
Sure. First of all, thank you to Left Bank Books for having me here. I should thank you for being with me here tonight, and thank everybody for coming. Shaker Heights is an inner ring suburb of Cleveland. It borders the city of Cleveland. It is a classic garden suburb. It was a planned community. It's a beautiful place. There were high standards for architecture. Only certain architectural styles were allowed. There are expansive lawns in front of the homes. There are parks. There are schools. There isn't much in the way of industry or business. And really, as you drive the streets, you'll often find you're going on a curved road rather than a block or with like a grid pattern. It's really meant to feel like, as one writer put it, that you're living not just near a park, but in a park. And so it was founded as a very elite, exclusive community around the turn of the 20th century, and then has evolved since then.
Right. And so when did you live there?
Well, I lived there from birth.
What year?
1968.
Right.
And until I graduated from high school, so in 1986. And then I go back. I've constantly gone back because my father, both my parents, my father and stepmom lived there, so I've been going back on a regular basis my whole life.
And what are the racial demographics like now? And what were they like when you were there?
So The city as a whole is majority white, but not overwhelmingly so. And the school system was, at the time I was there, about 50% Black, 50% white. Today it's about 40-ish% Black, about 39 or 40% white, the rest multiracial and a variety of other things.
And so what brought you to the point where it all started with an article that you wrote for the Washington Post. What provoked and prompted that?
The article?
Mhm.
Well, I originally started thinking about this even earlier when I was at the Wall Street Journal and I was covering demographics and I was thinking about race and what would be a good story. And I came upon the fact that Shaker had a new superintendent who was going after questions of racial equity in a very direct way. And so I was sort of intrigued by that, and I started thinking about some of the inherent contradictions in my hometown. This is a place that had for a long time really prided itself on racial integration and diversity, embracing diversity, and yet there was this yawning racial achievement gap. And so I was sort of interested in the contradiction of what was going on, kind of interested in what the superintendent was up to, ended up kind of filing those ideas away until I was able to pursue them into a story. But I knew that this is always kind of grew up knowing this was a special place, a different kind of place. And so the idea of going back as a reporter was really intriguing to me.
And so what took you back when you went for the Washington Post? Or what were the circumstances around that?
When I went back?
Like for what prompted that story to come about?
Well, I had already had the germ of the story from that I had reported when I was at the Wall Street Journal. And then I came to the Post and I had breakfast with my new editor sort of in that time between jobs. And truthfully, like the Journal wasn't really sure they wanted the story. They were kind of like, yeah, keep reporting it. You'll see. I don't know, probably. And I was like, okay. And then, so maybe that's partly why I never got done at the Journal. Then I came to the Post and I had this first conversation with my new editor and sort of trepidatiously pitched him this story at this breakfast. And his first words out of his mouth were, "That is a great story." And I thought, well, I'm in the right place. And I ended up building a whole series around racial integration in schools. And it was focused on places that were trying to work on integration. It wasn't about the fact that the schools had resegregated, which a lot of people had already reported.
That's been, yeah.
It was well documented. I was more interested in what does it look like and where are the efforts to try to do something different. So there were a variety of stories about that. And when this was the centerpiece of that.
And so then you do these stories, you're in your hometown, you're reporting there, and then what pulls you and compels you to actually say, no, I'm gonna do a deep dive? And did you have to take time off from your regular job, or how did that work?
For the book, you mean?
Yeah.
So after the story ran, it was a really long story, 6,000 words, which, anyone who knows anything about newspapers knows that's like a very long story. And yet I felt like I was just barely scratching the surface. I was still so interested in going deeper. And, often when you finish a big story, you're kind of ready to move on.
Right.
And I didn't feel ready to move on. I was like, I really want to stick with this. I think there's more to say. That same editor said to me, this could be a book. So that he pointed to a sentence in the story. He's like, that could be a chapter. And I realized, yeah, I could. And there had been a lot of journalism done about Shaker. It's been written about, I counted up, there have been 12 standalone stories about Shaker Heights in the New York Times since the 60s, which is remarkable for a suburb of Cleveland to be featured that many times in the New York Times. It's been written about by everything from Look Magazine, Reader's Digest, Washington Post before me. I mean, tons of places have looked at Shaker, but nobody had ever written a book about it. And I felt like this was something that deserved this kind of treatment, both because for two reasons. One, this very rich and just fascinating to me history of how racial integration happened in this place, how Shaker took a path that was so different than what we saw in so many other places. And then also on the other hand, what was happening today in terms of those modern day tensions around racial achievement in particular.
Right. And I mean, one question like at the heart of the book is, it's in the cover of the book, and a group of well-intentioned people fulfill the promise of racial integration in America, but also, you talk about how there are these two competing visions of what Shaker looks like and can both exist in America, right? It's like in this capitalistic, achievement-oriented markers of status and success, and also this feel-good liberal place. And I feel like for a while, like Shaker, you talk a lot about diversity in Shaker, but it seems like, it seemed to me that there wasn't a ton of like perhaps ideological diversity. Like most people there seemed to be pretty liberal. Like,
Well, that has happened over time. I mean, it was actually a pretty Republican area in the beginning because it was a very wealthy area. But what ended up happening is as the community really embraced its identity as this place that was celebrating diversity and embracing integration, people who didn't like that tended to leave, and people who were drawn to that tended to arrive. So it kind of shifted. I think so no, there is not much ideological diversity. In fact, the people who have a more conservative take are terrified of saying so on the record because they figure they'll just get drummed out of town.
they'll get ostracized. Now, since you grew up there, and as reporters, like I think we always think about our own biases going into a story, especially one that's so intimate. Like you grew up here, you have, that's like a huge thing. So how did you think about how am I gonna be able to look at this like in a holistic way and recognizing what my biases might be in this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one I actually thought quite a bit about.
Yeah.
I think a related question to that, even though you didn't ask it this way, is that I'm a white person writing about race, and could be fraught, and I wanted to be sure I wasn't going to be doing anything that could be problematic or offensive to anybody.
You don't want to get canceled.
Don't want to get canceled.
Right.
Absolutely not. And I also just genuinely don't want to offend people,
Right.
So so part of it, I'll answer it in a couple ways. Part of it is that I've been a journalist for 30 years plus years now. So like part of my training is to go and talk to people who are different than me. And this is not the Laura Meckler story. I mean, it's not. I joke that like no one's going to read this book about like, suburban girl grows up and does, to modest success. I mean, that's like not, that's like not that interesting. So you get a little bit about my background in the beginning and some of my thoughts at the end, but this is not really a story about me.
Right.
Although I, by all means, own the fact that I'm from this community, I care about this community, I do talk about my experience. But so I had a little bit of distance. So most of my reporting about this, even though it was a place I knew, it's also a place I don't live now. So I have a little bit of distance. So I was able to approach it really as a reporter and not as a citizen of the community. It's a fine line perhaps, but I feel like that's how I did it. And then the other piece of the really important question is that I made a very conscious effort to make sure I was talking to a diverse group of people and not just the people who were say my friends and people my friends knew. So I knocked on doors in neighborhoods where I didn't know people and that sort of thing. And I also had a lot of people read the book before it was published to get feedback, especially friends of color and also professional sensitivity readers, just to make sure that I was,
That's really interesting.
was not doing something that I wasn't aware of, where my blind spots might come through.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking, I actually had written down, like, how do you recognize your own blind spots when you're so close to a story?
Right.
And now you talk about the research, and one thing that's so impressive about the book is the vast amount of research that went into this. How did you organize and keep track of it? And then how did you decide? I mean, there was like hundreds of interviews and thousands of documents and all this historical research. And it doesn't read in a dry way at all. I mean, it reads in a very accessible, interesting, compelling way. So how did you, one, keep track of all the research, and two, decide how you were going to structure such a complicated and complex story?
So I'll answer the second one first. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted this to be narratively driven. I wanted this to be a story about people and not just a dry history or a policy book or something like that. So I gave a lot of thought about how to do that, because my original idea was I would just follow a few families, multi-generational families through the years.
Right.
And to make a long story short, I never found the right families,
Right.
and I decided I needed to try something else. So, but there were stories I knew I wanted to tell behind that. So for instance, and some of it was just this simple, like Jack Lawson was the superintendent of schools in the mid-60s to the mid-70s, and he led the school system to a voluntary integration plan, a voluntary school busing plan. At a time when communities across the country were fighting them, they adopted it voluntarily. His son is a friend of my dad's, and one day showed up at the house when I was there and just plopped into my hand an unpublished memoir his dad had written about his time in Shaker. So I was like, okay, I know a lot about this guy that isn't known and about his thinking about all of this stuff. So, he could be a character. So it was that kind of thing replicated, a dozen and a half times where I thought about like who are the like tentpole characters who I know are going to move this story forward, and decided, for those who don't know, the structure of the book is each chapter it's told by a person, a character who was important at that time,
Right.
and they help move the story forward.
Right.
So
And so how did you keep track of all of
how to keep track of it? Well, I mean, this is more of a technical question. Some of it, it's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine who had written a book, and I was debating between two programs. One's called Evernote, which is really good for keeping track of documents. One's called Scrivener, which is really good for writing manuscripts. And I was saying to my friend, he's like, well, you really need both. I was, well, yeah, but they both cost money. He's like, Meckler, it's $79. Buy both of these programs. I was like, oh, right. Okay. All right. I'm going to buy both of these programs. So I use both. I use Evernote for documents, and I use Scrivener for interviews.
Okay.
And Scrivener is a great way to organize interviews. Those all my digital interviews I had, paper and file folders. But the major challenge to this, frankly, I mean, you've got all this stuff,
Yeah.
so that now it's like, now what, right?
Right.
And so, I don't know if this is interesting to you guys, but hopefully it is. Each chapter kind of had to include what was important about the character, what was important about that moment in time, and also a theme of some sort, like something that pulled it all together. And those didn't always perfectly line up.
Mhm.
So each chapter was sort of its own mini project where I would say, okay, I'm tackling chapter 4. What needs to go in here? And I would just sort of do a review of my assets for this chapter and
Right.
make a list of like all the pieces that fit in here, and then kind of figure out what is the organization. And it kind of goes back and forth between the story, the narrative of the person, and the narrative of Shaker
Right.
more broadly. So I would just, and then, you tuck in people's backstories and that sort of thing.
Right. No, I thought that was very skillfully done, because you're right. Like, there had to be a way to propel the story forward, but give you enough background as you're unveiling it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very skillfully done. Okay, so of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the St. Louis equivalent of this neighborhood, of this community. And my initial thoughts when I was first reading it, and I heard several people say here, is that, oh, it just reminds me of your city in so many ways. Now, you went to college here.
Yeah.
Washington University. And so tell me about what your feeling is on that comparison.
Well, I've learned more about where it might be a comparison, in conversations like since I've been here this week than I have from being a college student, when you're kind of clueless about these kinds of things. I've talked to several people who've told me about U City and how it is a racially diverse community. The difference is that, from what I understand, like not a lot of white kids go on to middle school and high school in University City.
Right.
And so in Shaker they do.
Yeah.
So perhaps U City is an example of what might have been, that if the ingredients were there for it, if there had been more of a persistent commitment. Because, what happened in U City is what happened in most places,
Right.
which is, some people describe integration as the period between segregation and resegregation. So when it goes from all white to all black, at some point in the middle, it's integrated. But you have to, in order for that not to be the case, it really actually takes a very conscious commitment, because left to its own devices, that's what will happen.
And what you explained so beautifully in the book is the reason that happens is because there's all these systems built in, banking, real estate, all of this stuff, protecting property values, and racism, just there is some racism involved, right? And so,
Well, not just some, in the case, especially when we're talking about like what was happening, like when the first Black families moved into Shaker.
Right.
And I know this happened everywhere. First of all, if you're Black trying to move into a white neighborhood, every system was against you. You couldn't get a loan. You couldn't get a realtor to show you. If you couldn't get the architecture board to approve your plans, you couldn't get the permits. They were keeping you out, and that there were covenants. There were sometimes city ordinances. There were so many systems keeping you. Once you get it, once they got in, then all the systems, they're like, hey guys, time to flip it. So they start flipping it, and then they start driving white people out, block busting, door to door calls. Hey, have you thought about selling? This neighborhood's going to be all Black in 3 years. You better sell now and get your money out. Scaring white people who some of them might be genuinely prejudiced and don't want to live next door to a Black person. Some of them might just be scared,
right?
Like, of what's going to happen. Like, oh, my money's in this house. What happens if if I lose it, what if they're right? What if the property values do go down? What am I gonna do? Am I gonna be the last white person living here? All these fears that the system was ginning up, that the real estate industry and the banking industry couldn't get a loan if you were Black before. Well, now you're a white. Read this oral history from one of the leaders in this community that really pioneered a different way, and she talked that she would call realtors and ask to be shown houses in this neighborhood called Ludlow, where Black families had moved in, and they wouldn't show her them. And she tried to get a loan, and the bank wouldn't give her a loan because now it's risky. So it's crazy.
Right, and and St. Louis is like really well known. I mean, for the white flight and how segregated our region is, and you know, you and I had conversations about how if some of those impulses, people, you know, personalities, like that persistence had been there, not just in U City, but I think in some of the other neighborhoods too. Like I also thought, well, you know, if you think about integrated schools, we had a voluntary desegregation program here also. What was it? Maybe someone can fact check.
You mean from the city into the suburbs?
Right, but it also could go the other way.
Right.
And so, but that, and I think that there were degrees of success to that because there was still always an achievement gap between how Black students performed, even in these very high performance schools.
Right.
And I wanted to know, like, what was most surprising to you as you delved into the history and what you uncovered in Shaker?
Okay, so what was the most surprising to me was what do you think? So the thing about this remarkable way that the community fought back against the system was not as surprising to me because I knew a lot of that history, although I think it's surprising to a lot of people. What was most surprising to me was, number one, you know, I knew that there would be Black parents and students and alumni who had stories of, you know, implicit bias and discrimination that they faced in school. I mean, you know, how could there not be? But I was genuinely surprised at how many had stories like that. Virtually everyone I talked to had a story. Often they had maybe a good experience overall. They're glad they love Shaker. They're glad they went there. But you know, there was this time when, and there were almost everyone had a story like that, and those things really add up. So I was pretty shocked by the ubiquity of that. The second thing was that there was a level system in Shaker where you were placed in classes based on your perceived ability level, you know, advanced, regular, lower level, and I knew that there had been criticisms of this because it was so racialized that upper class is disproportionately white, lower class is disproportionately Black. But I was generally surprised by how far back that criticism went. So I found, like, for instance, there was like an Urban League, devastating Urban League report just taking down Shaker and the neighboring community on this point in 1980. But what really surprised me, if I can just say one more thing, is I was like digging through a box in the district archives. It was in the high school basement. I'm like sitting there by myself in the basement one day in the summer, and it's a box of all sorts of documents about other things. At the very end, there's this academic paper that had been written for a class at Harvard by a graduate of Shaker Heights High School, just saying the level system had evolved into a racist system and people were being steered and assumptions were being made about students coming in from the city of Cleveland, assumed to be in the lower level, regardless of whether they were meant to be there or not. And the counseling system being racist, it went quoted an assistant principal saying the level system is our biggest problem. And I look, and this paper was written in 1969. So 1969. This is before the first busing plan. This is when the Black population at the school is maybe 13% or something like that. It was, I mean, my jaw dropped open when I saw this paper. That it had evolved into this. It had evolved in 1969.
And it wasn't until the pandemic that they got rid of tracking, which is what that differentiation of students is called.
Right. They got rid of a lot of it, not all of it, but yes, they did, right in fall of 2020.
And in hindsight, does that seem like a wise decision?
No, to be perfectly honest, it doesn't seem like a wise decision to do it at that time and how they did it. I think that there's good arguments for reducing the amount of tracking they had, or maybe even eliminating it to the extent that they did. I think it probably would have made more sense to phase it in. It would have probably made more sense to do more training for the teachers before they did it. And it definitely would have made more sense to do it at a time when they weren't already teaching online and education being impossibly stressful already. However, I think what was on the other side of the ledger was like politically, it was easier to do at a time when people weren't really paying attention.
And also, there was a lot of protests, there was a lot of conversation, there was a lot
Right,
of
this is the
emphasis.
immediate aftermath
like-
of George Floyd.
Right. And to you, does this feel like a hopeful book?
You know, I went back and forth on this question as I was writing it, reporting it, and especially writing it. Like, what is my ultimate conclusion here?
Right.
Is this a story of like, well, we tried and failed and, you know, sorry, it's just too hard?
Mhm.
Or is it more hopeful? And I did come out on the more hopeful side.
And why is that?
Because in a country full of places, there are a lot more U cities than there are Shaker Heights is.
Mhm.
You know, there are a lot more places where where people aren't trying. I'm not cascading University City. I don't know enough about it to pass judgment on it. But there are plenty of places that are not even trying. You know, and it's not even on the radar. And the fact that this is a community that is still at it after such a long time and is, you know, no, they haven't figured it out, but they're still looking.
What are
And
the
that-
biggest challenges facing Shaker right now?
Well, I mean, so the biggest challenge is as it ever was, which is the Black White Achievement Gap. I would say underneath that is implementing this detracking system in a way that will be successful both for kids on the lower end and for kids on the higher end. Needs to work for everybody, and that's really important. And then they also totally separately, this is in the book a bit, they have a facilities plan on the ballot this fall that has to do with like rebuilding schools, and that's a big challenge of what's going on, but it's not as related to race, so it's maybe a little less relevant here.
So I feel like, you know, maybe this is a book that's hopeful about Shaker, but maybe not for the rest of the country, because it seems like a particular magic and chemistry kind of happened there, a confluence of like events that allowed this type of thing to work there. Because also, you know, there was also not that much economic diversity in the beginning. Like you say in your book, the Black families that were moving in were like all very professional, you know.
Initially, yes.
Initially. So it wasn't until later that demographic started to change.
Yes.
And I think now in America, we're in a moment, perhaps, you know, especially with the younger generations, where there's so much more class solidarity and people feel it's not as much like racial animus, but perhaps they don't encounter people that are outside their economic class nearly as much.
That's
And,
true.
you know, they might feel very comfortable living into an upper middle class Black neighborhood or having, you know, half of their neighborhood be upper middle class people of color, but not so much with like, you know, oh, well, we don't want people who are of a lower socioeconomic class than us in our neighborhood.
Right.
Or affordable housing in our neighborhood, or an apartment complex, or Section 8 housing.
So yes, that's true. But I do think, and Shaker has a lot of economic diversity now, much more than ever, and it is racialized. And but in terms of what the book can speak to for places that are different than that, maybe you aren't going to have a wholesale community wherever you have such a diversity in one single boat, but there are opportunities to advance this ball all over the place, and it's just about intention. Like,
Right.
Do you support multifamily housing, and so that there will be, you know, 20 families who have access to your school district, or do you oppose it? So that's not gonna, even if you support it, you're not gonna have a district like Shaker Heights.
Right.
But you're gonna have one that maybe is opening the door, cracking the door open. And I do, in that respect, I mean, do I want to go so far and say it's hopeful that people are going to do that? Maybe not. I don't know.
Right.
But I do think that, you know, by at least asking people to think about it and to think about making decisions mindfully and think about not just, well, will it be good or bad for my kid if we let these 20 other kids into my district? Maybe think about like, well, do I owe anything to those kids who I don't know? Like, does that matter? Is that part of my thinking? Is that part of the equation?
Right. I think one thing I really loved about this book as I was reading it is it made me ask myself very difficult questions. And did you, like, it made me ask myself, okay, not how would I respond if an African American family lived in my neighborhood, but more like, okay, what if they did want to put subsidized housing in my neighborhood? Or, how would I feel about that if the demographics of my kid's school completely flipped? Or, if there was like a lot of white flight, would we sell? Would we be part of that? Like, I interrogated myself as I was reading this, and I think some of the answers made me a little uncomfortable about how I would really feel.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's a lot of anxiety around, this is my largest asset. I have one shot with my kids for them to get a good education. And do I compromise on it? Do I?
I think it's also, the way I would encourage people to think about this is less so like in stark terms of, do I have the most possible privilege that I can possibly collect from me and my kids and hold on to it with all my might?
Right.
Or do I send my kid to be the only one in a low-performing, terrible, high-poverty school? Good luck. It's not that way. It's not like one extreme or the other. There's a lot in between.
Right.
And, if people make decisions that are just based solely on their own, what's best for their own child at this moment, then you will have systems like we have today,
Right.
And I just think that there are a lot of examples of people thinking bigger than that. And I do think that it's important for us all to at least stop and give it some thought.
Yeah.
Like, make these decisions mindfully about what we want for our communities. Otherwise we do have to sit with the fact that we're gonna just create a country where we have wealthy people go get their schools and poor people get their schools. And well, sorry guys. And then we sit around and say, God, I wonder why those schools are failing. It must be because the parents are terrible. Or it must be because the teachers are bad. It must be the teachers' unions. Or it must be the administration is all screwed up. And there may be pieces of truth to all of those things. But what it probably is that you've got high needs, high poverty kids concentrated in one place. And that is really hard.
Right. And there was a time when I was covering schools in East St. Louis, and they had a state oversight board with people, non-elected people, the state handpicked because they felt like they couldn't trust their local school board. There have been a lot of corruption, accusations of corruption. So, and I used to go cover those oversight meetings, and I got to know some of the members. And one of them had been in the community for a very long time, involved in the community for a long time. And he said, Aisha, sometimes I feel so hopeless that we can actually turn the ship around because it's such a concentration of need here that I feel like we just have to just send all of these kids to other schools.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just all have to go to other schools across the region. But that also has problems.
Absolutely, because nobody wants to lose their neighborhood school. Just they want their neighborhood schools just the same way everybody else wants their neighborhood schools.
Right.
So, but the question becomes, let's just take it on a simple thing. Do you oppose the multifamily housing in your neighborhood for people who actually want that? Who want to be part. Like, one of the themes of this book is like idea of belonging, and how do you create a sense of belonging? And is it like, no, this is my district and you don't belong here? Or is it like, hey, there's room for more?
I thought that was a really powerful question that the principal asked you, right? Or
A retired teacher.
A retired
at the
teacher
beginning,
asked you, like, what does it mean to belong in this school, in the AP class, in this district?
Right.
And what did you feel about, like you said, you always took your feeling of belonging for granted.
Right. So I'll just tell the story. Yeah. This is told in the very beginning. This really thoughtful, wonderful teacher named Hubert McIntyre, known by everybody as Mac or Mr. Mac, was, I had interviewed him for like 3 hours one day. He's a Black man who's retired, but is in the schools all the time, working with student groups. And we had talked about all sorts of things. And then he texted me, like, I want to talk to you one more time. Can I come by tomorrow? I was like, sure. So he comes in where I'm working and in the school, and he has a copy of my story from the Washington Post printed out. And, and he reads this part of the story out loud to me. I have not done a single book reading and actually reading from the book. So I'll read a tiny bit here. So he reads this aloud to me, where I had written about my own my own experience. So it had been about, well, here, I'll read this part. Now Mac was here again, and this time he wanted to ask me a question. My story, published in the Washington Post, centered on a controversy involving a young Black woman named Olivia and her advanced placement English teacher. It raised all sorts of questions about who was in these advanced classes and who was not and why. This is the quote from the story. Hearing Olivia's story got me thinking about my own, I had written. I was in AP classes and sometimes I struggled too. Kids in my class were crazy smart and it seemed to come so easy for them. But I never considered that my classmates might think I didn't belong there. It never crossed my mind that I didn't belong. And McIntyre says to me, he repeats this back, it never crossed my mind that I didn't belong. And he like sort of turned around that idea of belonging. He's like, what has to happen for students to feel like they belong? What does belonging feel like to you? And that was, to me, like that conversation just stuck with me so much because, and I realized like, this is like a good example of the privilege that I had, is that I'm in this class, I'm in this calculus class, I'm like, clueless as to what is happening on the board, or why is this equation going to show me why an x a line rotating equals the area? Like I didn't really understand, but I never didn't have to think that somebody would be like, well, what's she doing in this class, you know? And so
Right.
I think that idea of belonging, like we can take that to a larger extent. It's about a PTO or PTA meeting, and it's also about housing, a multifamily housing complex maybe.
Right, and it's always surprising to me to kind of hear that because, I mean, I had an opposite experience. I grew up in a very, very white, suburban school system in Houston. And our high school was like 3,000 kids, and I was like the only Muslim family. We were the only Muslim family, less than 5%, if that, people of color in that school. So I never felt like I belonged, like from the time from like the kindergarten to graduating. I always felt like an outsider in many ways, but I grew up in an immigrant family in which my parents were educated from the country that they came in and where they had very high expectations for us. And where we found a faith community like a distance away. So my parents were able to create expectations that perhaps teachers did not have. I'll never forget being pulled out of school, an elementary school class, and being asked to do, I was like in 3rd or 4th grade at the time, really voracious reader, bright student, and being asked to sit with a speech pathologist so she could check my English comprehension and speech to see if I needed services.
Mm-hmm.
And even as a little kid, I felt so indignant. Like I could feel my face getting hot thinking, oh my God, she doesn't think that I can speak English.
Yeah.
This is so insulting, and it always is so interesting for me to hear that, my classmates never had to think or even feel
Right.
that,
And imagine how someone feels when the same thing happens, but their parents are not super educated, who
Exactly.
have
Right.
the agency to go to the school and say,
Right.
my daughter's just
Right.
fine, thank you, leave her
Right.
alone. And in fact, they're like, well, maybe he does need special services.
Right.
Maybe he is behind in math, but I guess he does belong in the lowest reading group,
Right.
or whatever it may be.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely 100%. And it took me a while to understand the privilege of that, of having parents, having books in your house, and parents, who were very working class, but that's very different than being in, poverty in which you're deprived of basic needs. Like totally different experience.
I mean, not to diminish your
No,
experience at all,
absolutely.
because it
But
sounds-
I'm saying it's like, it is interesting how those things play out. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I actually kind of saw my own privilege in that situation.
Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to ask you before we open up for audiences is that the beginning of the book, and really kind of throughout, but especially in the beginning when you're describing the history of how this community started and how it kept Black people out and people of color out, is really an illustration of systemic racism. And what in some states would be called, oh, we can't teach this in our school because it's critical race theory, because it's talking about how systems oppress other groups of people and privilege other groups of people. Have you encountered any pushback like that? Has this been banned in any places yet?
No. I
Give it time.
I moderated a panel about book banning on Thursday night, and somebody on the panel said the best way to sell books is to get it banned. So maybe there's hope. This is not by any means like a treatise on critical race theory, but critical race theory means an examination of systemic racism, and this certainly looks at how that has played out in a very specific way. I don't really know how you look at what was happening, certainly with the banking industry and the real estate industry during that time, and not see systemic racism. I mean, it was redlining, it's like that's practically the definition of it.
Right.
The stuff that's happening more recently is that's where this, I think, documents the part that's harder for some people to see of what happens when there are different expectations
Right.
and where people are steered in different ways.
And I'm always fascinated to know if people in this community responded to you with reaction to this.
Mostly positive, to be honest. It's really been very positive. I mean, maybe the people who don't like it are just not telling me.
They're
But,
working secretly
I'm
on the
not
baby.
reading it.
Right.
but I've heard mostly positive reaction. There's a growing up in Shaker Heights Facebook page where somebody just posted a question and said, is anyone reading Dreamtown? And there were like a bunch of people saying that, yeah, I did, it's great. So I posted, well, I've read it and I think it's great. So, but I may not be totally unbiased.
Well, I want to give everybody in the audience time to ask some questions. So, okay, we'll start here and then Courtney, go back.
Well, real quickly, growing up in University City, the other issue is it was so bad, people would make homemade for sale signs. Blockbusters would come in and they banned it, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't ban for sale
But it
signs.
took a while for
Yeah.
the Supreme Court to overturn
But I
those,
think the other
yes.
thing, and you talk about hope, the hope is back then, back in the 60s, there were a handful of mixed marriages in the country.
Right.
Now there are 10 million. And the key is, it's not just education, but it's education, learning other cultures and people and all that. Young people don't care about this. It's us old folks. I heard the same arguments you guys mentioned back in the 60s, or that people talk about. So I think there is hope, but I think it comes with young folks.
Yeah.
And us liberal older folks.
And this also is, you
Yeah.
keep in mind that today I think the economic diversity is a bigger challenge,
Right.
frankly, than the racial diversity, but that's another layer.
Yeah, I also represent, there's a number of people that I know from U City. I first got introduced to you by reading the articles in the Washington Post about Shaker. And, but I taught at University City, as I mentioned earlier, between the 65 and 85. So I kind of saw, I lived the change.
Right.
When I started there, it was 1% minority. When I left, it was about 80% in a 20-year period. So that's one thing. Also, I also wrote about it in a dissertation, but within a 10-year block. It was the 60s, 59, which were kind of critical. In fact, there's a couple people in this room who were in the high school at that
I
time.
was. Yes, Dennis Woodback. He was my American Studies.
Say, I don't remember that.
Amazing.
He was one with
Dick Weisbeck. Dick Weisbeck did. But anyway, and one difference was I wrote about it, but I was writing a dissertation while I was still, took me years, while I was still working there,
Yeah.
living there. So I didn't, so I'm part of it.
Yes,
Right.
of course.
Which has its problems,
Yeah.
but also has its excitement.
Absolutely.
It works two ways. But one thing that I'm not sure about this, and your book really does interest me, and I'm going to walk out with a copy of it.
Fabulous.
Although I think I've read some of it, at least in the articles, but obviously it's not the same kind of depth
No.
that
Yeah.
inspired you to write the book.
Right.
But I've always wondered if one of the big differences was economic, that U City had much greater economic diversity in this particular period. Lots of apartments, lots of expensive homes, lots of less expensive homes,
Yeah,
where class and race kind of
absolutely.
came together earlier,
Right.
maybe
Well,
than they did in Shaker Heights.
Maybe it may have happened earlier. I don't know.
I don't know.
In 1989, which is the earliest date I could find where the census tracks race and class together, Shaker Heights median income of Black families was 65% of the median income of white families in 1989. By 2020, so 30 years later, it was 35%.
Right.
That changed dramatically.
So there was a
period.
big change during that period. I mean, 65% is still obviously a fairly significant gap, but it changed, and there were a lot of reasons to explain that. But yes, when you layer a racialized economic diversity on top, it is definitely a bigger challenge. But I will say, to Shaker's credit, that the schools, at least at the moment, are still hanging in there at racially
Oh,
balanced.
no, that's what impressed me when I
Yeah.
sort of, you just reaffirmed. I think one other thing too, not that, when you mentioned there was a sort of a voluntary busing.
Yeah.
Was that with the whole district or elementary schools, or what was that?
So the initial plan was that it came in two waves. The original plan was instituted in 1970, and it was targeted to one elementary school that was 88% Black. And the idea was that this is not good for kids. We're like 15 years after Brown, and they wanted to disperse. The idea was, the original plan was to disperse those kids to majority white schools, or I shouldn't even say majority, like almost fully white schools. What ended up happening was that Black parents complained, but what really changed it was white parents complained about the fact that it was so uneven, and so that they said, let's have voluntary both directions. So white parents and Black parents volunteered into the program to do cross busing within the elementary schools. The junior highs were balanced in the 60s based on boundaries, and then in 1987 they closed some elementary schools due to passing through the baby boom, and they then they redrew all the elementary school boundaries to make them all racially balanced.
Yeah, because one quick thing, and then other people may want to. In 1970, U City had a huge school board election based on a proposal to balance the elementary schools.
Yeah.
And really just politically just blew the community up.
Did it fail?
Just, well, it was an effort to create racially balanced elementary. One part of the community the writing was on the wall, the schools were going to become mostly Black. This was already the case, in the late 60s. And that's how fast this was happening. The schools on another part of the community were pretty much white. So the question was how to create
This is
balance.
what same situation.
And what happened was school board turned into a school board race. People ran like political parties, were for it, were against it. And the people that were against it, they won 2-1.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure the community ever really recovered, from that
Interesting.
moment in terms of what was possible.
Yeah,
I mean,
Probably what helped it in
Yeah.
Shaker was the initial plan was you opted in. So they didn't redraw the boundaries in 1970. They had a busing plan that was voluntary, and you
Yeah.
didn't have to participate. And then it was 17 years later when they redrew the lines.
And the other thing that happened there is a number of African American leaders read that election as a rejection.
right.
Even though
It was a
2/3
psychological,
even
I mean,
though
that's
it
how
was
they read it.
Yeah.
And so it became a psychological thing, and that's very early where Shaker
right.
seems to,
Well, Shaker, it was a more modest plan, and it was passed unanimously by the school board. And I read the letters that were sent to the school board. There were some vitriolic letters in opposition, some of them which are actually quite hilarious to read today. But one woman who wrote, "You may think I'm bigoted, and that's just fine with me." Okay. There was opposition, but I think partly because it was somewhat a mild plan. It was accepted, and then they were able to build that into a more aggressive plan over time.
thank you.
But I think it's interesting, the U.S. City experience as a contrast is very interesting and sad.
Yes.
I'm another U City in here, younger though, our kids went through U City schools, but, and we work in an almost all Black school up in Ferguson Forest that both of us do now, and, it is bad for kids to be resegregated like that. But the question I have is broader, how do we get, and there was, let me give you another example. There was a recent thing about let's freeze the property values of seniors, right? Which didn't take into account the fact that our schools need money, and all the arguments you hear about is, well, my kids are not in the schools anymore, as if the only people that need to worry about the schools are people who have their kids in the schools. How do we get to the place, and this kind of goes to more of your reporting than just this book, which I haven't
Which
read
is
yet.
fine.
But how do we get to the place where people see the public schools as a public good, like we see, you know, having the fire station and having the roads and having our police and having the libraries. And I say, somehow the public schools, people think that's only the concern of the people with kids in the public schools. And once you get out, you shouldn't be bothered with it anymore. Was that part of
Well,
the Shaker Heights?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that Shaker has dealt with that problem, and I don't know if this can be translated everywhere, is number one, is that your property values will be higher if the schools are good. So that's the self-interested argument, is to say, and like the slogan in Shaker is, a community is known by the schools it keeps, is that this is a place that people want to move to because there are excellent schools, and excellent schools need lots of money, essentially.
Do you think that the fact that St. Louis has all these religious schools that people can take as an easy option is part of the equation, or is that true there as well?
I mean, I think that everything that there's a lot of different choice. There's charter schools, there's religious schools, you know, and all of those things put pressure on the public schools, you know, because every child who leaves the public schools, not only does money leave with them, but you know, their parents, the parents who kind of have the get up and go to find another school, those energies are being directed to the bake sale at the private school instead of the bake sale at the public school. So, I mean, it's a hard question because you don't want to say to people, well, too bad, you have to go to this school and you don't have a choice. On the other hand, it does erode.
Kind of do.
Okay, well, it does erode the public schools, for sure. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Hey, Ms. Meckler, thanks for your book and your presentation. I appreciate it. I actually want to lean on your other reporting, which is that I'm kind of, you sort of said this as a context, I think, in what you said, which is that race is not the bigger challenge anymore. That's what I've seen from my 30 years teaching. And as an example of that, my district, and we work in the same school now, we purchased some tutoring, some at-home tutoring services. I don't know how much, but I'm sure it wasn't cheap for the kids to access online. And they've now found that pretty much the families, the more resources the family has, the more likely they are to access. And I'm wondering, as you've gotten around away from this story, even or within the story, it seems to me that's a bigger problem than the racial problem. That families without means don't take advantage of the opportunities that are presented to them, and then when we do present those opportunities where everybody can access them, even in my school is a struggling school. It's a school on lists, all that kind of stuff. But it's the kids that have more means than the other kids that are using the resources. Have you found anything?
Yes, I think
be hopeful. And tell me how.
I could be hopeful now.
Well, I'm asking.
You said you were. I know. Well, I mean, I will say that, there is definitely an analogy to what I saw in Shaker to that, on that same front. So for instance, in Shaker Heights schools, there is free tutoring at school every day after school. Anybody can access it. But yet obviously some kids are doing it and others are not. A direct comparison, they actually, when trying to dealing with these disproportionate placement in leveled classes, one of the answers was, okay, we're gonna do an open enrollment situation. So there aren't gatekeepers, and anybody who wants to go in this, if you want your kid in the advanced class, you can get your kid in that advanced class. And that the hope was to get more Black kids into advanced classes. And what do you think the result was? More white people used it. So the white people who had been in regular were now in advanced because their parents got them up there, and so it completely backfired. I think that the answer to this question is a really hard one, which involves like the hard work of family engagement. And, you see community schools that are working on this where they do a lot of wraparound services, like pulling parents in who are not involved with the schools, not taking advantage of the free tutoring. And, and this is not easy work. You know way better than I do that. So I think that's ideally the answer is, and this is true in Shaker, maybe not as acutely as it is in your district, but they need to do it just for the students there who aren't taking advantage of it just as much. And they do have a family and community engagement center. I think that work is really important.
I know you were talking about blind spots earlier, and I feel like this over my career. I kind of think when we start talking economics, we're getting into none of it.
Yeah.
And I think race has kind of been a distraction for a long time, of avoiding having to talk about those real issues. And do you agree with that? That the
I think it's
economics
both.
is the,
I think economics is the harder challenge, but I don't think we can just dismiss the race issues, because I've seen enough, talked to enough high-income Black families, at least in Shaker, who have run into issues of implicit bias of various kinds. And so there is racism at work too. There was a former superintendent in Shaker who he was the leader for over 20 years, and he actually got kind of nudged out the door because people felt he wasn't taking the achievement gap seriously enough. And my first interview with him, when I was working on the story, was I said, well, what do you think the solution is to this achievement gap? What needs to be done? Without missing a beat, he said, eradicate poverty and eliminate racism. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay. I was like, well, if there's an excuse if I ever heard one. Like, you put that as the bar, it's never achievable, so therefore I can never achieve my goal. So that was my first reaction, was that, like, this is like a total, like, deflection. But I have to say, the more I learned about this, the more I realized that there's a lot of truth to what he said, which is that those are the barriers, both of them. That said, though, some of that is in the school district itself. So when you talk about eliminating racism, it isn't just out there in the ether. Some of it is in your own buildings. So you have to actually address that. And the poverty issues, you can do a limited amount within the school district, and also help to address those issues too. So I think it's both and, like, it's both true, and also not just to throw up your hands and wait for, the world to spin off its axis into a utopia, and then everything will be fine.
I think another part of it is also that some of the parents who are distrustful and not engaged with the schools is because they have had their own terrible educational trauma and experiences in schools.
Yes.
So I think being able to, like, and if you did not have that experience, it's very hard to understand or relate to why people, like, I made a documentary about a woman who really cares deeply about her kids' education. And when, that's her number one goal in life. She's a single mom in East St. Louis. She's trying her very, very best. But when she got testing that showed that her son needed special services and had a learning disability and had dyslexia and, would benefit greatly from intervention, she said, no way. I'm not going to let my kid be labeled and be thought less than, because she herself had been labeled and put in a class where nothing was expected from her, and she was not going to have that same experience for her son. So her son now is being deprived of services he needs because of her own trauma.
How does she feel about walking into the school building?
She'll go into the school building.
Yeah.
She will, but because she wants to make sure that her kids are being treated just as smart, just as capable as every other kid in that school, if not more. But she will not let them be labeled, which is what teachers have to do in order to be able to get, like, specialized tutoring and aid and extra resources. So I think that's also a part of it, something that trust is part of it. And this will be our last question because we do kind of have to wrap up. Yeah.
Oh, great. I grew up in Cleveland, so I'm very familiar with Shaker. And I think comparing it to University City is sort of close in that it's a liberal type of community. Doesn't have a lot of commercial uses, but in terms of the demographics, it's probably more comparable to Clayton because it is, I think, a little more affluent than
Right.
New York City. But anyway, a friend of mine, him and his wife had their kids in the Shaker Heights School District for a number of years. And after a few years, felt compelled to move to Chagrin Falls, a more affluent area further out east. I don't know if the school district is out there, but and basically he just felt that more and more of the money that was spent by the schools was trying to solve the achievement gap. And so I'm wondering if that's a common concern that you heard in Shaker Heights, and how do the school districts between Shaker Heights and some of these more affluent eastern suburban areas in Cleveland compare?
Yeah, Chagrin Falls is a wealthy white community. It doesn't have a lot of these problems. So sure, like that if you're only you know, if you don't want any of your money to help kids who aren't like your kid, then that's a really great place to go. So, I mean, I just bluntly, you know, that there are people who are concerned about that they want to be sure their kid isn't getting shortchanged in any way,
Right.
you know, with too much, you know, I mean, the definition of equity is like every kid gets what they need, not everybody gets the same. Equality is everybody gets the same, and equity is everybody gets what they need. Well, that idea is very threatening to you if you're already getting a lot. So, because it's like, well, are you going to take it away from me to give it to someone else? What I would say to a parent who's worried about that and was trying to decide whether to move to Chagrin Falls or not is I would say, well, is your kid getting what they need in Shaker? Like, or are they actually not? Like, is this just a theoretical worry, or is there actually a problem here? And my guess is that, I don't know when this happened or what it was, if it was in response to something in particular, but, you know, I think that the affluent, high achieving kids in Shaker are, you know, getting a lot, still getting quite a bit and doing quite well. So I don't really know that there's a lot to worry about, but there are high taxes, and some of those taxes are going to support poor kids and getting them, you know, stuff they need in schools, no question.
Well, thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I ask one more question?
Well, okay, last question, but we're like really running a little bit over, and I want people to have time to buy books and respect Laura's time to sign them up. But
What are you working on now?
My day job as the
Yeah,
Washington
that's what I
Post.
mean. So what are you working on now?
I'm working on a series of stories this year on homeschooling, actually. So it's actually a totally different topic, completely about the rise of homeschooling and the implications for those kids as well as for the public system and related matters.
excellent. So everyone, please line up and buy Laura's book. Thank you so much for being here and for writing.
I will reach out.
Yeah.
You got it.
Oh.
Let's make sure I got it.